Hi everyone, it's Reese here, and today we're talking about abstracts, what a good abstract does, and tips and tricks for the abstract writing process. So let's begin by talking about what I've called the logic of an abstract. What is an abstract? So an abstract is a piece of writing, normally in the region of 150 to perhaps 500 words would be the absolute max, which is essentially a tinier version of a piece of work. It is a summary. It is for a person who is sort of interested in reading or engaging with a work, to sort of know what it's about, basically, to know what the key ideas are, which they can then pursue if they wish. And so the logic of an abstract is essentially sort of a summary. It's kind of a blurb. It's sort of, I imagine sort of the blurb on the back of a book. It is sort of the condensed version of a chapter, a book, a conference paper, whatever. And so the logic of an abstract, it's broadly speaking, all abstracts tend to follow the same sort of structural logic. And they have to be incredibly tight because you're normally doing them in an incredibly tight word count. And so an abstract will always, effectively always, summarise a research area. If your abstract is for, I'm going to pick one of mine, my psycho paper that I came out recently, say, summarise the research area, so talking about the psycho films, talking about the world of legacy films. And it will always present sort of the key argument, the key idea. What is the key contribution that the piece, the paper, the work is making? It's good to talk about the methods that the piece uses. What are the key methods, and what is the sort of the key strategy that the piece takes? Does it do close readings? Does it sort of do an overview? Is it a lab-based experiment? Whatever. Often with key examples, are there examples of specific things that you're looking at in the work? And then afterwards, a good abstract also presents the key conclusion or conclusions. What does your piece ultimately prove? What is the key takeaway? What is the key thing of value that the abstract contributes? The work contributes. A good abstract will enable a reader to understand an entire piece of work quickly. Say it's a journal article. A good abstract will enable me to essentially have an overview of the entire article after having read it. Avoid, so you don't want to have too much jargon or stuff that people won't understand. It is an effective summary of a piece of work. So say logic of an abstract, sort of summarise the area, and what is the key argument, and what is your key sort of hypothesis, and what are the methods and the examples that you use to explore that, and what is the key conclusion, what is the key takeaway, what is the key contribution of the piece of work. So there are two times when you're likely to write an abstract, and broadly speaking, they come sort of after you've already written the work, and then before you write it. So I'm going to deal with the after case first because it's normally the easier one. This is something you'll see if you're submitting to journals and they request sort of the abstract with the piece. It might be the case that sort of if you are submitting as a student, if you're submitting dissertations, theses, that sort of you'll write an abstract that will go along with it. If you're writing the abstract after the work, it's the easier side of the process because all the things I mentioned, knowing the research area, the key argument, and the methods, and the conclusions, they will already be within the work. So it's simply a matter, really, of sort of synthesising what's already there. And if you've written it yourself, you know what's already there. And so look through the work and try and summarise it. Try and pull out, you could even write a list, a sort of try and write a sentence or two about the research area. Try and write a sentence or two about your key idea, something that should already be in your conclusions, and try and look at the techniques that you've used, and look at your key finding. Something that will emerge again. That will be in the conclusion. And sorry, the key question in the introduction. Sorry, I said. And to look at the work you already have and try and summarise it. Try and write a sort of a shorter version of it. And bear in mind, you're likely to be operating almost kind of a tiny sort of word count, and just sort of pull out the things you already have. Try and synthesise what's already there, and you're able to write it in. And it might be the case that you need to refine this. So what I suggest, and when I was starting with abstracts and stuff, was I'd sort of just write all my notes, and I would write by hand. I'm a hand writer, and sort of a little summary key points of the research area that I included from within the piece, and try and write out what my question was or my main idea, and write all the examples, write write my conclusions, and then sort of translate that into a small form. When you're writing an abstract after you've done the work, you already have all the pieces, and roughly in the order that you need to include them in the abstract itself. So sort of just try and pull out, look at a chapter, look at your wider introduction, say how could I say that in a sentence or two. Your sort of main body, how could I say that in a sentence or two. Work on that and then try and sort of refine it down. And bear in mind the abstracts don't need to cover everything, so just sort of call out enough to give a sense of what is in the bigger picture. The counterpoint to the writing it after you've done the work is writing an abstract before you've done the work. And this is normally the case if you are applying to conferences. Some journals you might need to submit an abstract before you before you have to submit the full article. And this can be a challenge because often you're submitting an idea. It's unlikely, although certainly possible, that you already have the work. But often, if you're responding to a call for papers, a call for chapter articles, a call for journal articles, whatever, you're generally sort of almost kind of pitching an idea. And then, if it's selected, you will sort of be building it later on. This can be tough, but again, it is the same process. With some, I would say, extra caveats, right? So, again, figure out the key skeleton of the idea. So you may not have the work fully done, but think about it. And the key way to think is, what are you responding to? If it's a call for papers for a conference on a particular historical period, say, that gives you sort of broadly the research area. And think about your argument. What is the idea that you want to pitch? That is where the argument comes from. Again, you would have ideas to be refined, but you would have ideas of what you're going to do. You would have ideas of the key things you're going to talk about. You would have ideas of what you're trying to prove. I think it can be really, really useful to almost kind of think about like a skeleton of what this work would look like, almost in a sense like an essay plan. If this work is going ahead, what is the structure of it? And what is the context of the work? What is the key idea that you would attempt to prove? And what things would you look at to prove it? And then sort of what would you try and demonstrate? And it's kind of the same logic as writing a normal abstract. It's the same logic as pulling out an abstract after you've done the work. It's the same logic almost really of writing sort of an essay plan or sort of a plan of but trying to figure out essentially what the work is going to be before you then write the summary of it. And then from the summary, then you can build and expand outwards. It's kind of, the two things, there's sort of a logical order in either way. The first way is kind of condensing down. The second way is you sort of writing a tiny bit with a view of expanding outwards. But have a look, see what you're responding to, because that gives you a hint of your context. It gives you hints about what kind of things they're going to want. I will do a video on responding to calls for papers. Probably the next week's video, so have a look out for that. But yeah, figure out what you're responding to, sort of mentally have a sense of what your idea is going to be, and then you can pull the abstracts together in essentially kind of the same way that you would any sort of abstract or essay plan. So let me give you some tips and tricks and ideas for abstract writing. And I want to stress again, this is the kind of skill that, broadly speaking, becomes easier the more you do it. So the first time you do this will be as tough as anything. I remember my first one, I think it was so difficult. It was the form of abstract where I was responding to a conference call and wrote the abstract before I'd done the work. And my goodness, it was tough. But what I would say is seek feedback from people. So it's likely the case that if you're at a university, you have supervisors or sort of academics in the field who know what sort of this work should look like. So ask them if they're able to have a look. Broadly speaking, in my field of horror studies, of film studies and languages, abstracts tend to be about 300 words, so it's not sort of the major time commitment that reading a full piece is. And most, essentially, we can look at an abstract and know if it makes sense or not. And of course, seek it from sort of non-expert readers as well. And does everything you're saying make sense? Is it too jargony? Whatever. And a way that can be really useful, having a sense of whether an abstract works or not, it's again the kind of thing of read abstracts. So you'll be coming across tons of recommended readings, you'll be coming across tons of journal articles and chapters and books, and so have a look at their summaries. How do they summarise? Have a look at the abstracts for pieces that you've read. And you get a sense of how they've pulled out what they consider to be the key pieces of information. Look at what they do and see what works. And what things can you take and apply to your own work. And it can be really, really useful if there are any pieces that are sort of similar to what you're going to submit. And I mean that in sort of broad sense of sort of the field. If you are a history person, if you're a history student, are there any good sort of, historical journal articles where you can look at how the abstract's been written and sort of see what lessons you can take away from that? I think that's always good. Sort of a good writer is always a good reader as well. I think the two sort of go along together perfectly. So definitely try and sort of look at abstracts already, look at abstracts from works, look at abstracts from conferences as well, and sort of see what is there, what lessons can you learn, how can you follow what these pieces are about, or papers are about, or texts are about, based on the abstracts. And then lastly, a point that is sort of recurring, but not always, this is not always the case, but it might be the case, that with abstracts you're asked to submit a selection of keywords, 5 to 10 keywords, and that can be a useful way of sort of figuring out what is important about a piece. If you're asked to provide keywords, that normally refers to sort of key ideas within the text. It can refer to sort of the general area. It can refer to specific examples. It can refer to sort of key thinkers that you've pulled out. But if you're asked to think about keywords, really genuinely think about those keywords and see what ideas recur throughout the text. What are the key things? The way to think about it really is, if you wanted people who were looking at sort of general terms to find this work, what would be the best words that would get them to it? Think about that question, right? Because that is another way of sort of finding the heart of the piece. That's another way of sort of finding, it's a sort of a short form way into it. Less specific than an abstract, but another way into it. And if you can pull out some of those keywords, that can influence as well the shape of your abstract and the shape of essentially giving people the tools to find your work and sort of understand what it's about before they read it. So there we go, everyone. That was some tips and tricks and thoughts on writing abstracts. As I say in my next video, I'm going to talk about calls for papers, sort of finding them and responding to them. Something that I hope will be useful for sort of people who are watching who are sort of in the earlier career stages of sort of academic research. There's a lot of lessons in there that sort of I found out myself the hard way. So I'm hoping that some of my thoughts and reflections there will prove useful to people who are looking at going to their first conference or submitting their first paper. If those are tips that you think would be useful, please do comment below, let me know. I'm happy to sort of offer my advice and thoughts on ideas that I know people want to see, so please do share your sort of requests down below. Otherwise, make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, make sure to ring the bell so you know when more videos come. Thank you very much for listening to this video on abstracts, and I hope it's proven useful. I will very much look forward to seeing you all in the next one.